This Future Cities Africa episode is in conversation with the Charter Cities Institute. Kurtis Lockhart, Acting Executive Director and Head of Research at the Charter Cities Institute, is my guest today. We discuss new cities with new rules, the rise of African charter cities. Kurtis, welcome. It's great to have you on the show. Tell me a bit more about yourself, the Charter Cities Institute, and how you got involved.
First, thanks so much, Dan, for having me. So my name is Kurtis Lockhart. I'm Executive Director at the Charter Cities Institute. The Charter Cities Institute is a nonprofit think tank, a 501c3 think tank headquartered here in Washington, D.C. And, I could go into a story as to how I became first involved with CCI. So I am a student of political decentralization. I'm a political scientist in training, and I studied political decentralization in particular in sub-Saharan Africa for my master's and now for my doctoral studies. And so I was obsessed with this topic. And in the meantime, I also am a pretty religious observer of a few blogs out there, one of which is called marginalrevolution.com, that's written by a couple economists here in the States, Tyler Cowen and Alex Tabarrok. It's fantastic. If viewers want a great blog, they can check it out. So I read this regularly, and a few posts around this organization that was then called the Center for Innovative Governance Research. Horrible name. I'm glad we've since changed it. There were some posts on that organization and what they were up to with these new jurisdictions called charter cities. And I thought, okay, that's interesting. And after I saw that term a couple times, I clicked in and went down the rabbit hole of what are these charter cities? What's the idea? Paul Romer, who's the economist here that coined the term and founded the concept and idea. I watched and read everything that he said and spoke about the topic. And I said, okay, based on what I've read about political decentralization, charter cities could just be seen as the logical end of decentralizing political authority down to municipal and local levels, to city levels, such that these cities and towns are more empowered to do a bunch of things that I think are very important for them to be able to do. And so, lo and behold, I reached out in a timely way because there was a research fellow position available at then the Center for Innovative Governance Research. And Mark Letter is the founder. And I said, hey, Mark, I would love to apply for this research position. Here's my CV. And he said, go pound sand, you're too junior. And he didn't actually say that. He said, you're too junior. And I went about my business at Oxford, continued my doctoral studies, and taught a couple courses. And then Mark, did another podcast that I listened to called 80,000 Hours. If any of your listeners are in the effective altruist movement, it's a fantastic podcast. You should check it out. And this podcast he did got me further connected to the idea that charter cities is an important thing and I should be a part of it. So I reached out after that, and it was great timing because he was in London. So I took the train from Oxford to London, and we met up and hit it off, and I started at CCI that September. That was September 2019, just in time for 4 months later, the world to shut down. So good timing.
How is that for timing? What exactly are charter cities, and how did the idea come about?
The simple definition we use are charter cities are new cities with new rules. And so what does that mean? I'll unpack that. There are two components, right? The cities and the rules. And I'll start with the rules because we think that's particularly important. Rules means kind of economists use the word institutions, but the legal rules or codified rules of a place is what we're referring to. And what's really difficult for economic development and economic growth is if the rule set of your place that you're living in, whether it's a country, region, or city, is stuck in this bad equilibrium. You have a bad set of rules. And the tough thing then becomes, okay, how do you change rules? How do you reform rules for the better such that economic activity and economic growth can take off? And that's where a lot of countries, I think, in the global south find themselves, is in this kind of bad equilibrium when it comes to institutions and rules and norms, and they're trying to look for ways that they can reform the system to a better equilibrium. And so we see charter cities as a mechanism to do that, to get the deep governance reforms necessary to transition a lot of these countries from a place with predominantly poor rules to a place with better ones. So why do we think that's the case? It comes back really to an economist called Mancur Olson, and he had this theory, I guess you could call it, called the logic of collective action. And the logic of collective action is it occurs when you have concentrated benefits but dispersed costs. So I'll give an example because this is abstract so far. So in the US, the kind of main example that's used is sugar tariffs. So you have sugar farmers, I think in Florida. I'm Canadian, so it may be a different state. I think it's in Florida where the sugar farmers here in the States are. And the sugar farmers, because of the sugar tariff, make a lot of money off of this tariff. And so they want to see this tariff kind of continued into the future. On the flip side, the consumer of sugar, right? Me and you go to the store and we maybe buy what, $5 to $10 of sugar every given year. And that $5 to $10 is inflated a bit because of this tariff. It's inflated, say, 50 cents per bag of sugar. So me and you as consumers, while there's a lot of consumers of sugar, many more consumers than there are sugar farmers, because we are impacted by the tariff to a much lesser degree, right? We're paying 50 cents extra for every bag. That 50 cents isn't going to get me and you to rally and organize to replace and abolish this tariff. Whereas the farmers, because they're making, say, $1 million more per year as a result of this tariff, and there's few of them, so that's much easier for them to organize together. They are going to, organize and mobilize themselves to do whatever they can to rally their local politicians to keep that tariff in place, despite that tariff being on net suboptimal for society as a whole. So you can take this logic of collective action that Mancur Olson got at, and you can apply it not just to sugar, but to rules and institutions as well. So you see that incumbent political elites, they can be seen as the sort of sugar farmers in this example. The incumbent political elites, there's a concentrated number of them, and they currently benefit from the current rule set that's in place. And therefore, because they benefit, they have no interest in seeing it changed. In fact, quite the opposite. They have every interest in seeing that institution set proliferated into the future, even though it's suboptimal for society as a whole. And so Charter Cities says, okay, let's see that this is happening. Let's see that the current political elites have a lot of incentive to continue the current system because they're benefiting from it. And let's, instead of trying to get those political elites to pass national level reforms to get us to that better rule set place, that better rule equilibrium, let's circumvent those political elites. Let's not threaten their current rents that they're getting. Let's not threaten their current benefits. And let's concentrate reforms and localize reforms into a small, delimited jurisdiction that's on sparsely populated land. So you're not bumping up against these political elites' interests. And therefore, because you've concentrated reforms on this sparse, concentrated piece of land, and you're not threatening those rents, you can get, therefore, a lot deeper institutional reforms than otherwise possible. So that's the model. That's why we see charter cities as really, really important, is institutions are the number one long-term determinant of economic growth. And it's really hard to change institutions, and charter cities are a mechanism to reform them in a deep way that's necessary.
You've mentioned the economist Paul Romer in your introduction. He introduced the idea of charter cities, but I understand that the CCI's model for charter cities is different. Can you explain how?
I think it would first help to explain Paul Romer's model and then how we differ. So Paul is a Nobel Prize winning economist, but before he won the Nobel Prize, he was just a regular economist, and he gave a TED Talk in 2009 about charter cities. And his model it's still kind of new cities with new rules, so it kind of aligns with our very simple definition of it. But there can be different models that still fit that definition, and his was what we call the foreign guarantor model. So he advocated for a high-income country, high-income, well-governed country like a Canada, to come in to a low-income, poorly governed country like a Honduras, and Honduras would cede a large chunk of land, a city scale chunk of land, to Canada. Canada would then, in effect, import its quote unquote good institutions, its good rule set, and then be allowed to administer that city scale chunk of land for an agreed upon period of time or in perpetuity. And so that's why we call it the foreign guarantor model, because it's Canada coming in and kind of administering a particular chunk of territory in Honduras. Now, I'm sure listeners can see why some around the world were a little turned off by that idea. You know, and you're located in South Africa. And so I know some probably see that this idea could be construed as somewhat neo-colonial, right? You have Canada coming in and basically ruling part of Honduras. And I think that's a bit unfair for several reasons that we can go into later, but nonetheless, that impression continued. And despite Romer trying to get that model, that foreign guarantor model, implemented in both Honduras and Madagascar, it didn't catch on in either place. And he sort of gradually receded from the charter cities space because of that pushback around this model of the idea. So CCI's model is different. We advocate for, instead of a foreign guarantor model, a Canada coming into a Honduras, we advocate for a public-private partnership, a PPP, between the host country on the one hand and an urban developer, a private urban developer on the other hand. And in an ideal world, that urban developer would be from the host country, because then they understand the local context, they have connections, and they get it in a way that a guy living in Washington, D.C. like me would never be able to grapple with. And so that's the model. The reason we think the PPP model works or would work a lot more than the foreign guarantor model is because it gets around all of those difficult issues around sovereignty that Paul Romer and his model had. Right, the charter city under the PPP model will still be part of that host country's sovereign territory. It'll be subject to that country's constitution and criminal law and international treaties. So you're not jeopardizing or threatening sovereignty in any way. And so the other thing, I think, benefit that our PPP model has is that it aligns incentives. So the urban developer gets and maximizes its profits via the increase in land values, right? And so its incentive as the developer is to increase land values. And how do you do that? You attract as many people and businesses to this new city as humanly possible. And the way to make, or I should say, the way to attract people and businesses to a city is to make that city thriving and livable and well-governed and provide services and urban amenities that make it a great place to live. And so we think it aligns incentives in a really important way. And those are the two main virtues I think that our model has over Romer's, is avoiding that issue around sovereignty and then aligning incentives via the increase in land values.
Thanks, Kurtis. It does sound like a no-brainer, but how do we know that these charter cities will actually work? Are there any real-world examples?
We use a few common examples in the offices here at CCI when we're talking about charter cities. These examples are more proto-charter cities, but they're still illustrative and I think great examples of how this idea can be really, really transformative. So a few of the most common ones are Hong Kong, Shenzhen, Dubai, and Singapore. Let's start with maybe the model of Shenzhen. So in 1978, Deng Xiaoping comes to power in China, and he engages in this opening up to the world. He, looks over to Hong Kong and Taiwan and says, they're Chinese, we're Chinese. Why are they rich and we're starving? And so he tries to, in a way, replicate what has happened in Hong Kong and Taiwan. But back to our Manker Olson kind of logic of collective action, he doesn't want to uh, threaten a bunch of the Communist Party political elites because then reform will be undermined. So what does he do? He concentrates reforms in these localized, delimited jurisdictions that he calls special economic zones. And he starts 4 of those zones in the south of China in 1980, one of which is Shenzhen. And what does it do? Basically, these zones devolve a lot of powers and authority down to the local level officials. And number 2, these zones liberalize a lot of things across the Chinese economy. So going from fully Maoist planned communism to allowing in Shenzhen SEZ the first land markets, the first prices. They allow and build the first stock market in China. They have the first labor market, so people can be hired and fired. They can quit a job and go to another one based on wages. And so all of these liberalized sort of market oriented innovations are tested, tried, and clustered in initially these 4 special economic zones that Deng Xiaoping creates in 1980. And Shenzhen was and has the most remarkable story. So in 1980, it was a loose collection of fishing villages, poor fishing villages, of about 100,000 people. The year after the SEZ was declared in 1980, that Shenzhen Special Economic Zone attracted over 50% of all foreign direct investment in all of China. So just absurd, the transition from a bad set of rules to a good set of rules and what that can do in a very, very short period of time. Not only that, the Shenzhen population, as I said, was around 100,000 people in that, I think it was 326 square kilometer zone in 1980. Today, it's a thriving metropolis of around 20 million people. And so it just goes to show you that when you have better rules and good governance in a concentrated area, that's much better than the institutional set in the country as a whole, you're going to attract a lot of people. You're going to attract a lot of businesses. Shenzhen went from a backwater to the 3rd most economically productive city in all of China after Beijing and Shanghai in the span of 1 or 2 generations. And so I think this is a fantastic example of the power of this charter cities model and shows us what we can achieve as a species in a short period of time.
So, how exactly is a charter city different from a special economic zone or free port or other special jurisdiction?
There's a few key differences. Special economic zones, they tend to, number one, focus on like 1 or 2 sectors. So there tends to be like an approved list of sectors that can operate within the zone, whether it's textiles, manufacturing, or the zone is organized to be a tech hub or something like that. So it's pretty monolithic in terms of what sectors and industries can operate in a zone. A charter city, on the other hand, is mixed use. So not only is there sort of multiple sectors allowed in, but there is industrial use, there's commercial use, and importantly, there's residential use. So a lot of SEZs and industrial parks are purely a place where firms can locate and get certain incentives, and they don't involve a residential component. Whereas a charter city, the residential component is what makes a city a city. A city requires people in order to be a city, and that's what gets the what economists call agglomeration economies or urban agglomerations going that can self-sustain economic growth over a long period of time. So that's Number one is kind of the mixed use versus single use. Number two is just size. Like a lot of special economic zones and industrial parks are very narrow in terms of the amount of land that they are situated on, whereas charter cities are city scale. Ideally, too, the charter city is expandable, right? So as more and more people and businesses are attracted to the charter city, you want to be able to accommodate those people and continue to expand as that urban population expands over time. The other, I think, key differentiator is around the rule set. So with SEZs, when a government passes a particular SEZ legislation and then approves of a zone, they like that SEZ legislation is sort of set on the books legally. And so every time that SEZ needs to reform or change those rules, right? Because we're human and we're fallible, we're not going to get the rule set exactly perfectly right at the beginning of the setup of these zones. So we'll figure out where we're wrong over time. And those rules, therefore, then, when we figure out we made a mistake, need to be reformed and changed. Every time that realization happens, the zone operator has to go up to higher tiers of government and say, hey guys, we figured out we made a mistake here in this one clause. We need it reformed and changed. Can you guys please kind of pass or amend the legislation? And with that setup, you can imagine that takes a lot of time. And politics and legal reform and stuff is very slow moving. And when you're trying to grow a city rapidly and attract businesses to that place, that's going to hamper business dynamism. On the other hand, a charter city devolves that ability to change rules over time down to the city administration, the zone administration. And so that ability to not only recognize when reforms and legal changes are needed, but then to be able to quickly respond to those changes locally within the city administration is, I think, one of the key differentiators between a special economic zone on the one hand and a charter city on the other.
Looking at Africa, what are some of the biggest challenges Africa is facing that charter cities can help with, and how can it help?
When I look at African urbanization, I see both huge promise and huge potential on the one hand, as well as immense challenge on the other. And that's mainly just because of the sheer scope and scale of this challenge, right? Africa is the most rapidly urbanizing place on planet Earth over the course of this century. They'll be adding almost a billion new urban residents in the span of just under 30 years. So that's to 2050. That is a crazy amount of growth. A lot of cities are growing at an annual rate between like 4 and 5%, which is just unheard of. And that's over a sustained period of time. I say that can be promising and challenging. The reason is promising because we know that throughout history, throughout human history, cities have been places of tolerance and cosmopolitanism. They've been places of creativity and innovation and new ideas. They've been places of business dynamism where some of the most innovative companies in the world start and spread and grow. And they're where our most entrepreneurial and dynamic of our species go to get out their dynamism, you know? And so, if done right and managed right, they can be world changing, quite literally. However, on the flip side, if that urbanization process is not managed well, you can get all the downsides of density, all the downsides of living in close quarters and close contact with other human beings, including crime, right? Traffic congestion, contagious disease, as we've seen in the last few years. And so I truly believe, given the scale scope of urbanization, especially on the African continent over this century, and both the huge upside, but also the huge potential downside, that this is a crucial moment in terms of policy for human beings. And we're at a moment where the urban policies that we choose today are going to have ramifications and consequences for decades and centuries to come. You asked the question, what particularly can charter cities uh, help with when it comes to African cities and this challenge of urbanization? So I really break it down into three different pillars. One is a legal pillar. And so across the African continent, we had this problem of uh, colonialism setting up these really centralized state structures. And then when independence occurred slowly but surely over the course of a few years, a few decades in the 50s, 60s, and beyond, when the independence leaders uh, gained independence, they simply kind of took over those very centralized state structures. And so we had this problem of just a really over centralization of political power, usually in the hands of this imperial president. And you got this phenomenon of sort of big man presidents across the continent. And that's extremely tough when you have very heterogeneous countries, very multi-ethnic countries across the continent for historical reasons, right? If I'm president, and I'm from the yellow group, and I'm therefore incentivized to dole out public resources toward my own yellows, then that's going to make the red and greens and the blue groups really unhappy, and that type of dynamic can foster conflict and division and civil war and all the rest. And so this legal centralization of power into the hands of typically one president has a lot of negative and adverse consequences. And beyond that, African cities as a political unit have been historically kind of forgotten in this kind of race to concentrate power at the top. And so I think the fact is that only three countries, South Africa, Zambia, and Zimbabwe, out of 54 sub Saharan African countries, have the ability to determine the tax base and the tax rates and collect those taxes as well as access capital markets. Three countries have and allow their cities and towns to do those things. And so that is a huge, massive problem, especially if these cities and towns are going to be the main place where this huge, unprecedented process of very, very rapid urbanization takes place, right? They need to be empowered, those local officials, to accommodate and adapt to changing circumstances, especially rapidly changing circumstances over the course of this century. And without those powers to set the tax rate, determine the tax base, collect those taxes, as well as access capital markets and issue, municipal bonds, that's going to be really tough for these cities to do. And just generally, I've found in my readings of the situation that when you decentralize power to regions or cities, but you do not also decentralize fiscal ability to pay for those powers, that ends up being pretty disastrous. And so that's one pillar, is the legal pillar. The second pillar is the financial pillar. And I mentioned municipal bonds. Municipal bonds have been the main way that towns and cities have paid for and financed urban infrastructure over history. However, the municipal bond market in Africa can basically be described as non existent. Very few cities across the continent are able, number one, to issue municipal bonds. And then if they are able, it doesn't usually happen for various political reasons. Two cities in particular are good examples in this. So one was Dakar in 2015. They did all the due diligence and processes needed to, get a credit rating, get their fiscal house in order to become credit worthy for a bond issuance. And then, 2 weeks before the bond issuance, after all of these resources and time and efforts have been expended getting ready, the central government came in and sort of suspended the issuance arbitrarily for political reasons, right? The mayor of Dakar, I think, was seen as a political opponent, and so the president didn't want this, I guess, challenger to get access to large amounts of debt to fund some infrastructure projects. And so that is a huge problem. The second good city example around this financial pillar is Kampala, and when it tried to issue a municipal bond to fund its growth, the thing that happened was it realized that the regulations set the levels, like the monetary amount that a city can issue bonds for in Uganda, was set so horribly low that it made no sense for Kampala to dedicate the resources to even go forward with an issuance, because it would only be able to issue bonds for a paltry sum. And so it just abandoned the effort completely. And so cities and towns all over sub Saharan Africa are contending with these financial barriers to financing their urban growth that they're going to experience. And that's a huge problem. The third pillar is around technical capacity. So even if African cities and towns had the legal power, had the decentralized political authority over their jurisdictions to determine a bunch of different policies that are important, and even if these African cities had the financial, the fiscal ability, right, to issue municipal bonds, even if those two things were in place, if African cities and towns don't have the technical capacity to implement policies and to build infrastructure, then nothing else matters. And so we think that by these African cities and towns partnering with development companies that do often have the technical capacity and access to capital markets that allow them to effectively build infrastructure much better than often kind of weaker public sectors, that will be a huge win and huge increase to the technical capacity of these localities. So those are the three pillars, and those are how I see charter cities helping out, especially in the African context over this century.
Sticking with challenges, what is the biggest challenge and risk in creating these charter cities in Africa, and how can this risk be mitigated?
We've talked with a lot of governments, a lot of policymakers, both at the national level, regional level, local level, a lot of international organizations, etc., private city developers. I think, from my experience, the main challenge is the risk of kind of expropriation, or the risk that the political regime that may be agreeing to these reforms now in the present, that political regime is not going to be the same one that continues in perpetuity. So how am I, an urban developer that's going to and agreeing to invest hundreds of millions, if not billions, of upfront capital in this new city project? How am I guaranteed that a different political regime that may come into power in 5 years is going to adhere to the agreement and commit itself to the agreement credibly, to the same agreement as the political regime I'm talking to now? And so this risk of political expropriation is something that CCI as an institute has thought about a lot, and we've talked to a lot of smart people about. And there are some things that I think organizations interested in this, governments interested in charter cities, and new city developers interested can do to mitigate the risk of expropriation. One of them is just like a revenue sharing agreement. So within the public-private partnership agreement between the developer and the host country, there should be a revenue sharing agreement such that every year a certain proportion of the fees and taxes and leases raised by the developer in the locality is remitted to the host country, right? That way, the host country benefits from not just the development of the city, but like has an actual incentive to see it succeed over a period of time, because the more it succeeds, the more money and coffers and resources flow into the host country's coffers. And so that's number one. Number two, and this is a similar point, but I think distinct, is the host country should have an equity stake in the development company, right? This is an urban developer. There's, publicly traded or private urban developers all over the globe. And I think an ownership stake from the host country or the state government or both aligns incentives over the long run. Again, if the development company succeeds and the host country has an ownership stake, owns a decent chunk of the development company, then it succeeds as well, and that's aligning incentives. So it's less likely that the government is going to sort of kill the goose that laid the golden egg, so to speak, even if the regime changes, because it's continuing to transfer resources into government coffers. So that's one thing. Another way to mitigate risk is, we think, I guess you could say, involving kind of objective and international organizations in the kind of governing council of a charter city would, I think, be helpful. And so one of the examples I use here is, if you brought the World Bank into the project, for example, the World Bank lends on a concessionary rate to a bunch of countries across the global south. And therefore, those countries, because they're getting such a good rate on those loans, they do not want to jeopardize at all access to that concessionary rate. And so if you have the World Bank as either they're invested as an equity owner or they just simply provide loans to a particular project, the government, I think, is much, much less likely to interfere with that project in any way, because that could jeopardize, loans and other projects that the World Bank is helping the host country out with. And so I think involvement by these types of organizations is important for risk mitigation. Another thing that could be done is floating the development company publicly. So publicly trading stock of the development company. Why? Because I think if sort of big institutional investors like pension funds were investors in the development company, that they can exert some influence on the political class not to interfere with the project, right? Because that jeopardizes then, in this case, the pension fund's returns. And I think that's another important way. You have the political class, you have the business class, regardless of what we think is morally right, they talk to each other and they influence each other. And if these pension funds that are often very powerful in certain countries have their returns threatened by the political class threatening to interfere in a charter city project, they wouldn't like that, and they'd pressure against it. So I think that's another way to push back against this risk. So those are a few of the things we've been thinking about. There are several others. You can have political risk insurance, for example. You can purchase political risk insurance from the World Bank entity called MIGA, MIGA, and there are other things as well. But I think those are the main ones that you can do to push back against this main challenge of expropriation.
Kurtis, but still, if you have this new city that is drawing skilled people, large organizations, foreign direct investment, etc., won't it still be seen as competition by the local institutions?
This is a good question. And this is why I think I started my previous answer about what's the challenges and how do you mitigate the risk of expropriation. I started that answer with a revenue sharing agreement, and also the fact that the host country should have an equity stake in the charter city development company. I think precisely for this reason is, if the host country is a true partner in the success of this project, it is much less likely to see it in a competitive light. And therefore, it is much less likely to interfere in the project. However, if the host country does not have a investment stake in the success of the project, and the project, this new city, is attracting a bunch of its population, its best and brightest, and it's attracting all the major companies and headquarters, and the host country is seeing no benefit or spillovers from that, I think it's much, much more likely to see that project in a competitive light, and then start to think about ways to interfere and undermine the long-term success and viability of that project. So it's extremely important to for the host country to be true partners from the beginning in these endeavors. If you do not get that piece right, I think that can be the number one thing that threatens the sort of long-term nature of these things for exactly the reasons that you bring up. But I will say, just on this point of competition, because I think it's really important, political competition, I think, is one of the main, in a way, benefits charter cities can bring. I think if you look at history, you see, and this is back to my point about over centralization of power, you see in places where there are competing political units within one sort of nation state, those competing units tend to discipline themselves a little more because there are other options, right? If there is another unit that's better governed, providing a more conducive environment to growth, it's providing its residents with better public services and more amenities, then me in Unit A, I'm going to see Unit B, this better place, and be attracted by it and see all its success and perhaps be incented to move from Unit A to Unit B. And that very fact disciplines political Unit A that I'm currently stationed in. It checks Unit A. And that's been sort of the history of political development, the history that it has sort of well recorded data in early Europe and sort of frontier the United States is, let's take the United States. There's the 13 colonies that were established in the eastern part of the country. And people in New York, if the government proved itself to be not very good, had the option of not just going to the other 12 colonies quite freely and mobily, but they had the option of also, packing up and taking their family out to the frontier where, the new states were not a thing yet, and they're just kind of setting up along the Mississippi and creating their own thing. And so this has a disciplining effect, and that is extremely important. And due to the over centralization of power that I mentioned earlier, especially on the African continent, I think introducing a new form, in a way, of political competition through the addition of these charter cities, these new spaces, these new jurisdictions that provide new rules, that can produce the same type of disciplining effect.
Your team at CCI is starting a coalition focusing on African cities. Can you tell me more about this coalition, what you're trying to achieve, who are the partners involved, and how organizations can get involved?
The Next 50 Cities Coalition is a coalition of stakeholders across the spectrum of actors involved in setting up new cities. That includes governments and public officials. That includes other policymakers at international and multilateral organizations. That includes new city developers themselves and the private sector. And that includes civil society and research organizations and universities. And we found that it makes all downstream conversations much easier and more fluid if you approach those conversations with a coalition of partners that are all kind of united under one banner and pushing and saying that this reform will be game changing and can help with a huge challenge that, in particular, African cities and towns have to contend with over the next few decades, which, as I mentioned earlier, is this problem of really, really rapid urbanization, the fastest urbanization rate on planet Earth, combined with a constraint around the resources that a lot of cities and towns can dedicate to this problem. And so that's what Next 50 Cities is all about, is number one, setting up this shared model, this new model of urban development, and having these coalition members all, bought in and agreed to this shared model of urban development. Number two, mobilizing resources behind this new model of urban development. Number three, de-risking urban investment. Right now, investments in African cities and towns are higher risk. And this is why you don't see, for example, a thriving African bond market at the municipal level, is because, among other things, of the lack of a credit history, or if there is a credit history. It's not a great history. And so this thing is risky, and that influences a bunch of other things. And so de-risk urban investment is important. And then if you get these things right, and the right coalition members are pushing with you behind these reforms, then the ultimate aim, the ultimate objective of this Next 50 Cities coalition is to build thriving new cities to contend with this challenge of urbanization on the African continent. And that way we can get the upsides of urbanization and cities, like generators of growth, creators of new innovations, producers of new ideas, rather than the downsides of density, crime, congestion, contagious disease, and the others. And so we think this is a game-changing coalition. The way you can get involved, I'm going to parrot our website now, chartercitiesinstitute.org/NXT50. It's very easy to sign up. We've made it as easy as humanly possible. You put your name, and that's pretty much it. And you'll be part of a community of actors dedicated to this very exciting model of urban development and urban transformation.
Kurtis, in closing, what key takeaway do you want listeners to have about charter cities?
The key takeaway people should have is be optimistic about the future. This trend of urbanization on the African continent is huge and daunting. And from my conversations, a lot of people involved in this space of cities and urbanism get overly doom and gloom about the future. I think we need to see this wave, this very rapid wave of urbanization, as one of the biggest opportunities humanity has to lift masses of our species from poverty into prosperity in one of the shortest periods of time possible, just as China did after Deng Xiaoping's reform in 1978, right? Through the combination of urbanization and special economic zones that I talked about earlier, China effectively transitioned over 850 million out of poverty in the countryside into prosperity in cities, right? A lot, like the bulk of that 850 million people lifted out of poverty in 40 years was due to this rural to urban migration to cities that had a new set of rules, like Shenzhen and others. And we want to sort of take that model, take inspiration from it, and use it to spur this other wave of human flourishing and human prosperity across the African continent. And it's possible and it's doable. We just need to get the right coalition formed and get the right policies in place, ideally before all of these humans begin the transition to cities. I think getting this stuff and these policies in place before that happens is extremely important. So we need to start now and urgently today. And so that's what I would leave listeners with, is there is a ton of possibility and promise. We just need to seize it.
A big thank you to Kurtis Lockhart, Acting Executive Director and Head of Research at the Charter Cities Institute, for such an insightful conversation around the rise of African charter cities, new cities with new rules.